One often hears the claims of dual loyalty when it comes to Jewish Americans, especially those in US government, even more so when it comes to positions involving foreign affairs. Accusations range from just promoting Israel as a US ally to promoting hawkish policy against Israel's regional enemies, often clashing with American interests. I have in the past looked at the Jewish, and subsequently Gentile, role in communism, money lending, the Iraq War, etc., usually with the intent of showing that the simplistic JQ understanding of these topics is one-dimensional and insufficient to really grasp the subject. And in this article, I will attempt to do the same, specifically looking at various Jewish figures in different administrations and how they may compare to their Gentile counterparts. Trump's second term. Working our way back from the present moment, we can begin with Stephen Witkoff. The Jewish real estate investor has been a special envoy to the Middle East under Trump's second term, and so far has either negotiated deals or is in the process of doing so with various enemies of Israel. The ceasefire deal with the Houthis made no mention of ceasing hostilities with Israel and solely focused on US-Yemeni relations. More importantly, Witkoff has been the main negotiator with Iran in regards to its nuclear program, taking a softer approach than Secretary of State Marco Rubio and former National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, both Gentiles. And while at the time of this writing talks are still ongoing, the general sentiment is that Witkoff is generally more amenable to talks and negotiations than others in the administration. Various articles have gone over the differences among these figures. I will include some here and here. Witkoff has further been under fire for seemingly criticizing Netanyahu and Israel for not bringing the war to a close and accepting some kind of deal with Hamas, whom he has directly been in talks with, bypassing Israel. The recent release of Eden Alexander is part of this, involving Jared Kushner's Jewish college roommate, Adam Bowler, who, along with Witkoff, secured Alexander's release. Obviously, these Jewish figures aren't arguing to bomb Tel Aviv and free Palestine from the river to the sea, but clearly are not just following orders from Jerusalem. The most revealing rift between Witkoff and Rubio/Waltz on this issue was Trump's striking down of an Israeli plan to bomb Iran before negotiations for a deal were to start. Witkoff was in the camp of Hegseth and Vance, who did not want to see U.S. troops embroiled in conflict in the area, opposed to Rubio and Waltz's hawkish view on the subject. It remains to be seen how a lot of these issues will be resolved, but clearly if one were to pick the most pro-Israel and anti-her enemies figure in the administration, Witkoff would not be at the top of that list. Outside of the administration, but on this topic in the realm of Congress, Bernie Sanders is one of the more vocal advocates of a ceasefire, and introduced a resolution to block arms sales to Israel. Biden term. It is a bit more difficult to assess the Biden administration given the then president's mental state and the closeness to the outbreak of hostilities between Israel and its neighbors. All three main individuals who worked on the Middle East during his term were more or less compliant with Israeli actions and only occasionally offered some pushback. Blinken, the only Jew among them, did put pressure on Israel to allow aid to go into Gaza at the risk of halting U.S. weapons, even telling Netanyahu that Biden would not come to meet him in Israel if aid was not allowed in. He also generally urged restraint, along with Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin, against escalating militarily with Iran following Iran's attacks in April 2024, as well as in October of the same year. None of this was ever a condemnation of Israel or breaking off ties or anything of the sort, but rather just part of a de-escalatory tone from the Biden administration. Largely, the administration was seen as accommodating to Israel, and Biden was given the moniker of Genocide Joe by those on the left. However, some Israeli hardliners did critique Biden as not giving Israel enough legroom to fight its war in Gaza and elsewhere. Blinken also offered his own critiques of how Israel was operating in Rafah, but at the same time refused to apply Leahy laws to Israeli army units that were credibly accused of committing human rights violations. None of this should be that surprising, given that A, Blinken, like all other Jews in every administration, was/is the underling of the president who makes the final call, no matter how mentally impaired, and B, Israel is a long-term U.S. ally. Whether people think that is a justifiable label or not, that was facing multiple fronts of war following the most deadly attack on the country in its history. Even Arab leaders privately expressed a desire to see Hamas defeated, according to Bob Woodward's book on the topic. The U.S., even out of plain foreign policy momentum, was not going to shift gears and reverse its policy of general support for Israel, no matter any humanitarian concern or protests. It didn't ever stop it in the past, at least not immediately. Indeed, some in the administration even pushed Israel to be aggressive at times, with Brett McGurk, Gentile, urging Israel to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon even after Biden publicly was urging restraint. Although McGurk was also followed in this line of thinking by Amos Hochstein, an Israeli-born U.S. official. However, it seems that McGurk was especially hawkish on the issue. Jake Sullivan, as well, came to the defense of Israel, praising the U.S. attacks against the Houthis following their strikes on Tel Aviv, as well as coordinating the defense of Israel against Iranian missiles by U.S. troops and allies in the region, pursuing further sanctions on the country following this. Overall, one should just read Bob Woodward's book on this for the best understanding, certainly more multifaceted than what I have generalized here, underscoring the futility of just looking at people's ethnic backgrounds for any kind of real analysis, but going to continue on regardless. Trump first term. In regard to Trump's first term, Trump was clearly pro-Israel across the board and hawkish on Iran for starters. No doubt Jewish funders like the Adelsons played a part in this, and Jared Kushner took a leading role in promoting the Abraham Accords, as well as the move to recognize Jerusalem as the capital and recognition of Israeli sovereignty of the Golan Heights. Also, according to Seth Abrams, Israel, along with multiple Gulf states, backed Trump's campaign in the hopes he would be tougher on Iran than the previous Obama administration. Whether one accepts everything the book, Proof of Conspiracy by Abrams said is not really germane, with the main point being that those countries clearly backed Trump for being anti-Iran. Clearly a lot of Jewish influence nonetheless. However, Gentiles were not exempt from the pro-Israel and anti-Iran sentiment in the administration either. John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened, details his efforts to, among other things, promote sanctions on Iran, discard the JCPOA deal, and label the IRGC as an official terrorist organization, oftentimes in direct opposition to Jewish Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin, who argued for a more light-handed approach when it came to Iran, primarily for economic reasons and his carrot versus stick approach, but clearly Bolton was the hawk compared to Mnuchin's relative dovishness, including his agreement with General Mattis not to strike Syria again in opposition to Bolton on the issue. Also, according to Bolton, Kushner waved off attempts from Netanyahu to reach Trump prior to a potential meeting with Iranian officials to discuss saving the JCPOA, siding more with Mnuchin on the subject rather than Secretary of State Pompeo and Bolton. Incidentally, both Pompeo and Bolton replaced Rex Tillerson and H.R. McMaster, shifting the Trump admin at the time into a more hawkish stance on Iran. Obama. Speaking of the JCPOA, the deal was formally agreed upon in 2015, but had been building momentum since 2012. During the first Obama term, it was established that regime change was not the goal, with Gentile William J. Burns' new strategy towards Iran aiming to change Iran's behavior but not its regime. This was not necessarily the easiest thing to do, with even Richard Haass, a Jewish opponent of the war in Iraq during the Bush years, expressing dismay at the lack of Iranian cooperation with the Obama administration to strike a deal in the early years of his tenure after believing it could succeed. In Chapter 5 of his book, A World in Disarray, Haass discusses the failure to prevent North Korea and Pakistan from getting nukes via sanctions regimes, leading to his skepticism of doing the same with Iran. However, Obama did not want another Iraq, and so was more keen on negotiations rather than hostility, opting to distance himself from the Green Movement protests taking place in Iran, a move supported and influenced by Middle East specialist Dennis Ross, Jewish, as well as Tom Donilon and Dennis McDonough. According to James Mann and the Obamians, author Gordon Goldstein may have helped shape a more dovish Obama policy with his book on the Vietnam War that was apparently voraciously read by Obama staffers. This type of thinking may have in part led Ben Rhodes, half Jewish, to lead the effort to remove troops from Iraq in 2011, as well as have a generally skeptical view of interventionist policies in the wider Middle East, clashing with people like Hillary Clinton, the main proponent of the Libya intervention, and Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, whom he referred to as part of the blob of the foreign policy establishment. Rhodes himself laid the groundwork for the Iran deal, and with the sanctions regime established by Stuart Levy, was able to coax Iran into signing the JCPOA along with Secretary of State John Kerry, half Jewish, in 2015. This section mainly dealt with Iran, but I did want to throw in that Jewish advisors to Obama, such as Abner Mikva and Rahm Emanuel, encouraged Obama to stop Israel from building new settlements on Palestinian territories, and Netanyahu famously did not get along with Obama and felt betrayed by Obama's backdoor deal with Iran concerning the JCPOA. Bush. The Bush presidency was more or less dominated by the Iraq War, so I will mainly focus on that. It's well known that many neoconservative Jews in the Bush administration heavily favored going to war with Saddam. One can make arguments that Wolfowitz, Libby, Pearl, Faith, etc. were pursuing war as a strategy for U.S. primacy reasons, for Israel, or perhaps a mixture of the two, not necessarily mutually exclusive. This is important to note, but all the neoconservative Jews in the administration worked under Gentile leadership, namely Cheney and Rumsfeld, who both advocated in their own right taking out Saddam primarily for U.S. primacy reasons, as I have laid out in previous videos. Nor was Powell the dove that many believed, but rather just attempted to get an international coalition against Saddam rather than the U.S. taking him on solo, even after warnings by Jewish advisor Richard Haass on the perils of going to war. In fact, Powell recognized specifically what would become known as the axis of evil of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea in the early 90s, after the Cold War was over, as particular countries to watch out for, and defended the controversial defense planning guidance paper of Wolfowitz and Zalmay Khalilzad, arguing for American supremacy in the post-Cold War world. The phrase later used in a famous Bush speech was originally coined to be axis of hatred by Jewish speechwriter David Frum, but later changed to evil by his superior Michael Gerson, technically one-quarter Yid according to Wikipedia, and Iran was added by Rice and her assistant Stephen Hadley. Similarly, Rumsfeld and Bill Clinton, during his administration, singled out these countries for particular concern as well. I don't want to get bogged down too much on Iraq. Perhaps I'll do a write-up coalescing all my thoughts from previous videos into an essay at one point, but suffice to say, it was a Gentile and Jewish endeavor and by no means just a war for Israel. One can look at Chapter 4 of Knowing Too Much by Norman Finkelstein for a digestible breakdown of that, or again my videos. With both Gentile and Jewish groups in the Bush White House having been hawks well before the Middle East was the main point of interest, research Team B for more context on how people like Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz analyze foreign threats. Moving on from Iraq, Iran was not an issue far behind and was somewhat connected, having involvement with the Quds Force and presumably behind many IED bombings against US troops. Both Faith and Wolfowitz left the Bush administration in 2005, but the surge of US troops in 2007 and overall involvement in the region continued, even after a Rumsfeld memo to Bush calling for fewer troops shortly before his departure from the administration. Top officials in the Bush administration attacked Iran for its continuing nuclear program and officially labeled the IRGC a terrorist entity in 2007. Later would be officially declared a terrorist organization. I guess there is a legal difference. Particularly, the Cheney family were big advocates of countering Iran, with Liz Cheney having helped Iranian dissidents and Dick Cheney purportedly having mulled over asking Israel to strike Iranian targets to stop their nuclear capabilities. Beyond. Obviously, the pre-9/11 world was much less focused on the Middle East, and most of my reading has been on post-9/11 stuff anyways, so I will end it around here with just a couple more additions. Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, half Jewish, under Clinton, did indeed oversee operations against Iraq after the first Gulf War, but these were generally limited, and he was not keen on an all-out war against Saddam at the time, which angered neocons. Also, the appointment of Madeleine Albright, raised Catholic but ethnically Jewish, and Cohen to replace Warren Christopher and William Perry, respectively, in the Clinton administration was seen as a welcome change to the Iranians at the time, with Albright being particularly eager to strike a deal over their nuclear program and ending hostilities. Also worthy of note is Dennis Ross at this time, under the Clinton administration, helped form the Oslo Accords, which many see as giving legitimacy and more ground to Israel over the Palestinians. I haven't looked at it too in-depth myself, just throwing that in there. There is probably a lot more ground I could cover, but I think I will end this article focusing on Henry Kissinger, probably the most influential Jewish statesman, certainly in the US, of the 20th century. Kissinger had a mixed relationship with Israel and the Jewish community. He did not see Israel or the Jews as personally very important to him, despite his heritage, and mainly saw Israel as just another proxy in the Cold War conflict with the USSR. Favoring détente, he opposed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which promoted the freedom of movement for Jews in the USSR, saying if they put Jews into gas chambers in the Soviet Union, it is not an American concern. Kissinger's overall détente policy with the Soviets was heavily criticized by the neocons at the time, like Richard Perle, incidentally. Specifically on Israel, there is debate about whether or not he intentionally held up the airlift of weapons to Israel during the Yom Kippur War to make Israel bleed for the purposes of laying out a more long-lasting peace amenable to U.S. efforts in the region. From what I can gather, this particular claim made by Admiral Zumwalt was not entirely accurate. However, what is certain is that Kissinger did not want Israel to come away with an all-out victory, warned Golda Meir not to do preemptive strike against Syria and Egypt, and basically saw the whole episode as chess moves for American Cold War policy. Not out of any concern for Israel as such, but did indeed save Israel at a time of crisis, while also somewhat contributing to the crisis. Basically a pretty mixed bag, but certainly Israeli nationalists do not hold Kissinger in high esteem. The main takeaway here is that looking for some kind of elaborate group evolutionary strategy among Jewish politicians and statesmen in the US is a futile endeavor, especially when one compares it with their Gentile counterparts. Plenty of US Jews in positions of power support Israel to different degrees, just like Gentiles in those same positions, as well as take differing attitudes on Israel's enemies, like Iran or Saddam's Iraq, just like many different Gentiles do and did. I did not focus on other foreign policy topics because it would have gotten really convoluted quite fast. I mean, what is the Jewish motive when it came to the politics of the Vietnam War, or dealings with communist China, etc., etc.? I'm sure plenty of obsessive spurgs could answer that in all types of colorful ways, so please consider it a rhetorical question. I think all this is quite obvious to people who don't have preconceived notions about Jews or put people's ethnic backgrounds as the primary source of one's decision-making and ideals. Of course, looking at one's background is interesting and can provide some insight, but only so far, especially when looking at the multifaceted decision-making process of American foreign policy, which, regardless, more or less ends with the president, who has never been Jewish and was never just some empty husk molded by advisors. Well, maybe barring the last year of Biden's presidency. I could go on or probably provide more examples with more research, but I think you get the gist. If one wants to analyze US foreign policy, it's best to do so with a different hermeneutic than the Jewish question.